Okay, so welcome to Video006. Just quickly, I've been getting a lot of email about the live action series. If I haven't replied to your email yet, I will be as soon as I can. I'm definitely going to be replying as much as I can to this. Obviously, it's been a massive response about the course, and I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited for us to go beyond January 12th and spend a year together really diving deep into learning all this stuff. And not only that, but all the career-related material that we're going to do too, like portfolio reviews, career intensives, and everything else. So I'm excited, and yeah, there's a lot to go still in the training that we're currently doing. We got this video and the next video, as well as a few other bonuses too. But like I said, for those of you interested, I'm really looking forward to getting to do the live interactive reviews, all the bonuses and everything else. That's the cool thing, is not only will you get all the training that you're currently doing, but there's also archives of several other courses, all my training DVDs, all that stuff. Sorry, I didn't mean to get into a whole rant. I'm just really excited about it, and I have been kind of like typing away, responding to so many people that I just figured I'd kind of just mention ahead of time that I will reply to all your emails, and I am excited about this. We're creeping up on the deadline pretty soon, but all it means to me is that we're that close to getting started, and I'm really excited because the live action series is by far the best course I've ever created in terms of just how high end we take it. Everything is a real shot, a real sequence, a real production. So, I mentioned this earlier, but I do feel like once you've done even like 1.5 terms, you've got enough stuff that you can sit down with anyone and say, look, I'm doing what you're doing at your studio, and I'm doing it all by myself. So, there's no hesitation. There's no way that anyone could ever say you're not qualified, because you've got the proof right there. You can do entire shots, entire sequences, and take it all the way through to final, which to me as a supervisor is the most critical thing. So like I said, I'm a little bit excited. I can't help myself sometimes, but this video we're going to be doing a lot of cool stuff. It's definitely going to be really awesome. If you haven't had a chance yet, check out Star Wars. I know it's been a little while. It came out a few weeks ago, but yeah, more inspiring stuff there. So I mean, think about all the stuff that you're doing in this course and how you can take it a step further, what effects you could apply to it, what you could do with it. And yeah, I feel like just because the lesson revolves around certain key things that I'm showing doesn't mean that you can't make it your own and own the shot by taking it a step further and improving on it and adding more to it. Alright, so I'll leave it there. Let's get into this video. Okay, so now let's start to get this set up for rendering. So let's look at the lighting, and one thing I'm just going to mention is that sometimes you'll have an HDRI which you'll light with, and for something like this, if you were to use an HDRI, there's nothing wrong with that. Just obviously if you're shooting on a green soundstage, then typically there's going to be a lot of green spill, so usually you want to go and suppress that, figure out what the background you're going to be replacing it with is, and probably incorporate that into the HDRI as well. If anything, just at least suppress all of the green in here. But I also want to point out that you don't need to always work with HDRIs, and in this case I figured I'd prefer not to, for a couple of reasons. One is just to show how to manually light something like this, and in addition to that, to bring back the point that you don't need to incorporate that as part of your workflow all the time. I talk about this in the live action series where we do a lot of HDRI lighting. In fact, a majority of the shots are all lit with HDRI. And because of that, I bring it up that you don't want to rely on it. It's a great tool to kind of get you close to there quicker, but at the same time, it's definitely not a substitute to doing real lighting. So right now we have these spotlights, okay, and just making sure that if we click on the spotlights, we don't want to use these for any of the actual lighting. I just purely want them there for the fume effects lighting. So if we click exclude and change this to include, this is the inclusion list. We're not including anything. So it's still going to work with fume because it's set up inside of fume. I'm going to do this to the other light, but we're not going to be lighting anything in the shot with it. We still have this V-Ray light that we kind of threw in here, and that's just sitting over here. I hit everything for a second, but I'm going to bring back the character, and we had this turned off. So I'm going to turn this light on, move it back, and just position it up in the air. I'm going to duplicate him, it, her, whatever we want to call it, and do the same thing over here. And I'm just going to get some crude lighting going, okay? And finally, we got a little bit of backsplash as well. And this is kind of similar to the lighting we used. The lighting setup we had was about 5 LEDs. So there's a couple of keynotes and LEDs anyway. So it is typically mostly up here. We had, like, I don't want to imitate the exact lighting, but basically if I was, it would be something kind of similar to this. There's a few more lights in the back, just really hitting the rim, things like that. But it's not really too important. I just want to kind of get something rough going. I am going to set these relatively low, so let's just say 1.5 for this, 1 for that. This one over here we'll set to 2, and then this one over here we'll set to 2.5. Okay, so 1.5, 1, 2, and then I think it was 2.5. And anyway, I'm not, you know, I'm more just going to eyeball this, so I'm not really too worried about it. For now, let's go back to our I think it was this guy here, right? Yeah, so this guy here, let's just drag him. Actually, sorry, let's just grab the gray material and drag it on top and render out a frame. I'm just going to use that as a point of reference to get a rough idea. It's more going to be the liquid and the blend shader. So I'm going to turn on GI. Where's brute force? And I'm just going to turn my background off. So let's just kill the background and make this, make it black. The other thing is that let's actually hide our upper body character for a second and bring in our face render. So this one here, we'll drag our shader back on, and we'll look at this because this is actually what we'll be rendering. So this is what we're getting so far with that. So I'm going to hide my liquid just for a second so we can see this a bit better. And the other thing is that if we want the blending to work, because it's been a while, don't forget that you will need to turn on your particle systems here as well, or at least this particle system here, the placement shapes. So do keep in mind the fact that we are getting to a point where if we want, we can start to look at baking things out. So if we went into our mask in the V-Ray distance texture, we can see we're using shader mesh activation. And so we could actually look at setting this up as an Alembic cache and exporting that out as well. So let's just do that really quick. Like I said, usually I want everything to be completely procedural, but towards the end, as an effects TD, you're typically wanting to bake everything out to head over to lighting. So at this point, you would usually bake everything as Alembics or X meshes, however you want to do it, and send it all out. So that way, they're not having to worry about your big rig, because you don't want to have to give someone your effects, say, "Hey, please light my stuff," and then mention, "Oh yeah, by the way, you got to have P-flow on, this plugged into here. Make sure you have this visible and working. Blah blah blah." You just want to keep it ultra simple, and then that's why baking out your textures, all that stuff, can be a good process. But mesh shader activation is being used for both of these. So going over to mesher shader activation. And actually, just one thing really quick that I might jump into is, let's see, I'm just going to get ahead of myself a little bit here. Our mesher, where are we? The activation shape. So with this, I think that what might be worthwhile is to run an Alembic cache on that now. So that way we don't need to turn, you know, our system on. I mean, I guess we just need this on because it's cached. But from there, just getting our mesher activation shapes and just simply exporting this as an Alembic. Okay, and then bring it back in. So I'm going to do that really quick, and then we'll bring it back in. And it's just that way it's going to be a lot faster to load, and if we were to save this stuff out later, we can do it a lot easier than having particle flow nodes and caches and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Alright, so I just brought that back in, and so under meshes, I've got the Alembic sorry, where are we? Yeah, here we go. Mesher shader activation. So I'm going to call this ABC shader activation. And just by having this here, it's going to make life a heck of a lot easier. I can turn on displacement and just drag this out here really quick. Go V-Ray. Just, yeah, add that in. And then same deal, oops, with our map here. So yeah, just throw that in there. So I was jumping ahead and doing it, but I figure I better show these steps. So just to play it safe, we also have the face render, and I just want to make sure that, yeah, we're using that there. Okay. So now I can hide that. So I did that kind of quick, but I just figured, you know, spare the moment. It'd be good to just make sure that we've got that set up. So here we can see now we have displacement. Working on everything. And the cool thing is it's all baked out, so if we wanted to save it to a clean file at this point, like everything is pretty much standalone. Now, I've just unhid the collision upper body. That's a holdout object, but at least when it's rendering, we'll see it occlude everything. And as I mentioned, the match move doesn't match the shoulders, stuff like that, because it's just not necessary. But all the stuff that is necessary is matching. Okay, so that's looking really good. There's one thing I just want to double check. Okay, that's fine. It looks a little bit weird from there, but I can see it. Okay, so okay, and yeah, so basically the pass is looking good. I'm going to add a little bit more displacement on the hand. We'll make that -1 as well. Let's now introduce the fluids in here. Right now it still has that red texture on there, but anyway, as we can see, this is all working and looking really good. Okay, so let's start to set up the shaders and get everything ready for final rendering, because we've got all of our effects built up, and now it's just a matter of like balancing things out a little bit. So just looking at this for a minute, I'm going to move my light over more, make this one more of a rim. And let's go on the light lister. And this is just an easy way for us to dial in some of the settings. So V-Ray light 1. I'm just going to dial these down, make this one V-Ray light 2 the key light. And bring these down a little. So all we're doing is, I'll go to the top view. making this the strongest light, and then these ones here are more dull, but they're going to fill things out just a little bit more. So that way we just have a strong light coming from over here, which is just proper generic character lighting, really. So I'm going to hide the lights though. Let's get into the shader, which is going to be obviously the critical thing. So we got the top of the hand, then we got the hand. One thing I'm going to do here is, I think I mentioned this already, but in hindsight, I would love to, instead of just having the one piece of the hand here, I should have probably had the entire hand, because it definitely does make things a little bit more difficult later on, just having just the top of a hand and that's it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a separate piece for the remainder of the hand, and that way we just have that separate, and this means that the shader can expand a little bit more beyond that, because the liquid does obviously go past where the decal, like where the mask areas spread out to, and because of that we still want to make that kind of wet around those areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the character here, and I'm going to do a edit mesh, I think, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to select the whole character, set that ID to 1, and then we'll just go in, select a bunch of this, and then start deselecting. Yes, I mean, in hindsight, that's one thing I would have changed, I think, is just keeping these separate. For the most part, it's good. I'm going to get a little bit more of the wrist just here. Okay, and simply put, I'm going to set this to ID 2, and that way I just have these selection IDs set up. Now I'm going to right click and clone the object, and then isolate the selection of 1, and we'll just call this render hands. What are we calling it here? We're calling it hands render. So we'll call this wrist render, I guess. Anyway, so we'll go back into the face selection, and all I'll do is I'll say select ID 1 and then do a delete mesh, okay? And that way we get just that. And then I'll go to the other model, and we already have that selection, so just put a delete mesh on that. Okay, so now we have that and that as separate objects, okay? So it should make life a little bit easier. So we have the displacement map on the hand here, and then this is just regular object, and then we have the displacement on the head. So let's just take one more look at this, and then we're going to dive into setting up the shaders and doing all that good stuff. So yeah, just make sure none of this is on. And bear with me, I'm going to start constructing, actually before we render anything, I'm going to construct the shaders, and let's just get this all going. So we can pretty much blast all this stuff now. What I want you to consider is we're essentially in the lighting phase now. So I want you to consider that we're in the lighting phase now. So I'm actually going to call this lighting version 1, take 01. And the reason is, like, we can start throwing things away. We're not going back to resim or anything. If we did, we go back to effects. So I basically want to get our shaders set up. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to go here, I'm going to add this, and get the top of the hand. I'm going to add that. Sorry, add the hand here. In fact, what we'll do is we'll just say reset materials, and then I'm going to, in slot 2, add the hand, and then slot 1, add the face. Now, I'm not sure, I think we had this set to black. If we didn't, whatever color we have, I'm just going to set this to be like a dark gray for now. It doesn't matter what it is, I'm just setting it to be dark gray. And same deal here. So I just jumped ahead a little bit here. Basically what I want to do is I want to just reset the material editor. So it's just blast everything away. I'm going to add the head, and then I'm going to go to this one and click here, add the hand. Okay, and I'm not sure what we had this set up to, but basically I just want this to be, you know, nothing, just a dark gray texture for now. Okay, so that's the base material. This is going to be a dark gray, and then we have our infection shader, and you know, that's exactly how we got that set up. So both of these just dark gray. In fact, we can just copy paste instance, so that way that's all good. Okay, so that's looking really cool. Everything looks fine. I do have GI turned on right now, just as a heads up. So basically, at this stage, you know, I'm going to go through from scratch and show what I want to do and get it all built up. I did just go to the render menu and just turn GI on for a second because I just want to see how this looks. One of the key things that I think that we should do at this point is just consider what we want to actually use as a background. And for now, I think I'm going to just throw like a random HDRI in. I'm not too concerned. So yeah, GI is turned on. So I'm going to, in fact, sorry, I'm going to go back. I'll keep this off. I just wanted to test it for 1 second. But basically, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to create a new HDRI map. So V-Ray HDRI. And I'm just going to throw in a random HDRI. So I'm literally just throwing this in for now, and then you know, later we can go back and throw in whatever you want. This is not an HDRI that I own, and therefore, you know, I can't share it. I'll go out and shoot an HDRI, and it's something that we can distribute. I just, for now, like, it's not that big a deal. You can get free HDRIs online. I'm happy to leave links if you have any troubles finding them, but Google free HDRIs, you'll find millions. But usually, and this is something that we do in live action series, I go through very in depth on how to shoot, stitch, and create HDRI maps. And just in this one instance, I don't have any handy. So I'm just dropping this in. I'm going to set this to be a spherical map. And I'll keep everything else the same for now. I literally just want to drop something in here, and it's just mainly just to get some kind of lighting that has reflections and has different color information and that just isn't flat. So going back to lighting for 1 second, I'm going to make it active, and let's just go into V-Ray light in the top viewport, drop that in there. I'm just going to make this a dome, and we'll drag this map in there. And we'll just set the multiplier to 2.5, just something quite small. So I think that works well. It's mainly because we're about to get into doing the liquid, and I want to make sure that we get it all set up correctly. Okay, so I'm going to loop back to the hands pretty soon, but let's dive onto the liquid. So I'm going to unhide the liquid and the ABC fluid emission. So just our mesh here. And I'm just going to create a new V-Ray material. Call it liquid, and just assign it. Okay, so first things first, let's just set up like a bloody color. I don't want to go too crazy on this. something like that. Okay, and we'll just give this a little bit of reflection. Sorry, I mean fall off to it, but we'll crank up the reflectivity. And the refraction, I'm going to make this fairly red. Okay. So all we're doing is we're quickly going in and setting up a basic liquid shader. Just because it's transparent. So we'll make this fairly thin. So I'm blasting through this pretty quickly. But, I mean, all we're doing is we're just setting the surface transparency, essentially, giving it reflectivity, giving it some refraction. I think we'll end up putting a map in the refraction just to break that up. But overall, I think we'll keep this pretty straightforward. So let's just go down here. I think the main thing is just going to be, we'll put some fall off on the refraction. So where are we? Refraction, fall off. Let me just double check something up here really quick. So I'll turn off effect shadows. We'll bring the multiplier down on the fog as well. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Just enable a color. Sorry, what am I doing? Enable a color curve here. Just like our diffuse, I think it was 22. Main thing is we'll just get a brighter refraction on our whites. So start with red. And then, yeah, we'll just bump these up a little bit. Okay, yeah, so I mean, we're just getting some basic fall off going on in our refraction. And then we'll just throw a bit of noise on. We'll need to do a bit more work to it, but I mean, the settings I threw in is basically just something that's going to be fairly transparent, fairly reflective, and obviously kind of tinted red. So I think in general it's going to work out well for what we're doing. For now, I'm probably just going to work with render region just for like while I'm trying to work on the shader. The other thing I might do is just go into my render environment, so like rendering environment, and just for now, so we have something rather than black, I'm going to drop my HDRI in here as well. Okay, so we're just going to have something in there let's just make sure this is, yeah, spherical. So, you know, I believe this HDRI is pretty low res, and like I said, I'm just throwing something in so I have something to work with, because I don't want to have like the green splash of the chroma key of the actual plate. So just having something a bit more different is going to work out well for what we're trying to pull off. And I'll bring back character render upper body. But overall, this is looking fine. My render settings, I mean, is not too important, but now that we're starting to get into the shaders, I definitely want to bump this up a little bit. So I'm just using progressive right now, so all I'm doing is just allowing it to sample a bit more. So one thing I just realized I did is, I don't know how I managed to do it, but I put it into the reflection. I should have this in refraction, so I apologize for that. That's why this isn't as reflective as it should be, because we want absolute reflection, but for the refraction I want that variation. So that's one thing. Also reflect on backside, drop down our depth, just make that a little bit slightly higher, bring our fog multiplier lower, because we don't want that to be too strong at all. Okay, now we're getting that reflection that was missing earlier, so it's looking a lot better. Okay, so we're just going to slap that together, but it's working pretty well. Now I want to go back in here and do some adjustments. So I'm going to turn off the liquid and that. I'm actually going to drag this fluid emission into the liquid as well, just so that way all of that's in the same spot. But we'll have that turned off, and let's just focus on the actual shader here for a minute and just like really get this perfect. So as I mentioned, we're just going to have like a dark gray material. Oh, and one other thing I just want to quickly mention, I kind of jumped ahead here, but just make this not a matte object anymore. Okay, for now let's just keep it as a regular object. Just make sure that you know, I'm just saying V-Ray properties, just make sure this is checked off and there's alpha contribution, just so that way it's holding out correctly. And also because we now want to render the fingers. But anyway, so focusing purely just on the head, like I said, we'll just make like any dark gray shader. It doesn't really matter right now. Obviously the main thing is the infection and the mask. Those are the critical things. So let's just go into the mask, and let's just call this infection mask 1. And so I just want to double check all this. So a color correction, our map, yeah, everything here looks totally fine. The main thing that I want to look at is just our V-Ray texture. I just want to dive into our cellular. And yeah, everything with the mask right now looks good. There's going to be some stuff that we are going to do to this. I mean, I like how this works. I'm not a big fan of the color, so that's definitely one thing that we're going to do really quick. But we're going to need to go beyond this, because as soon as we reveal the shader, like that's the thing. Initially we want the infection to begin to spread, and then that creates the liquid, but eventually the liquid overtakes everything, and so this won't be visible for very long. And I don't want it to specifically have like the liquid interacting with the live action plate too much without there being infection as well. So we are going to set up a secondary shader that's going to just allow the areas that have liquid to kind of create like a really hacked together wet map for it. So anyway, with the infection shader, so going here, we've got all this cellular stuff going on, which it is what it is. It's okay. I definitely want to kind of move away from any blues, things like that, so I definitely want to shift the hue more to more reds. What I'm kind of tempted to do instead is to actually pull just a bitmap in. I think that we can get a lot more variation as well as a lot more detail just by using a real texture. So what I might do here, this is going to look a bit weird, but I'm just going to kill the diffuse, and let's just drop in a bitmap. And I randomly just downloaded some pictures of meat and stuff like that, which I know is kind of gross. Again, these are things that I pulled from online, so I don't have permission to distribute myself, but I believe I just googled bloody meat, and then I think that was it. Like, I might have typed texture for this one, but bloody meat I think is what I got for this one, and then I just went to settings in Google and chose like a 4K map or a 4 megabit map. So we get this, which, yeah, looks interesting. So one thing I will do, I just clicked the view image. So with that happening, I'm just gonna drag this box around the meat, just so that way it gets really any white areas in there. Close that, hit apply. So all that's doing is it's cropping this in, so that way there's no white area. Okay, and yeah, I know it's not the most pretty thing to look at. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down to output and put in like 0.4, something like that, and that's just going to give me a darker texture. I know I'm going to need to tint this to like make it more red, but you know, I think that right away we're going to get something a bit more interesting. Right now it's just being applied to the head, so I might hide the hands for now, only because I know me, and occasionally I'm going to end up looking at this because it's in the foreground and wanting to color correct it. So for now, let's create a selection set. Let's select all of these objects here, and we'll call this character. So I just typed it up here, hit enter, and now whenever I want, I can just select everything very easily. Okay, so now I'm going to deselect the head and hide everything else, and we can unhide it very easily. But this is looking cool. It definitely gets rid of the kind of crazy colors, but I feel like it needs a color correction. So let's click bitmap, color correction, keep. And I think for the most part, let's just tint the saturation up ever so slightly, but more importantly, we'll shift the hue. And that's just going to push it a little bit more into the red, and a little bit more brighter, and then we'll make this darker only because I'm gonna pull the contrast down basically. So it's a little bit too dark, but we'll play around with this a bit more. But in fact, let me try bringing this up. So I think that works better. At least the colors are more neutral. I'm also going to bring my gloss, sorry, not gloss, my, I'm going to kill, I think what we'll do is we'll clean some of this stuff out. For the shader, I mean, you know, having bump, having displacement, that's fine. But I wouldn't mind getting this map and dropping this into the reflection as a copy. I'll just bring it down to about a fifth of what it should be, and at least that way it's going to get a bit more reflective. And we'll take a look at that. So that way it's a little bit more like brighter and tinted in the right colors. So I'm liking that so far. It doesn't feel too wet, but I'm not too concerned about that. A majority of this will be covered up. So I think that's fine. We'll go up another level. Now, one thing that I want to start doing is figuring out how we're going to render this out, like how that's going to work. And the way that we'll do it is we'll build masks to blend between, you know, the gray shader, which obviously we don't want, and then all the other ones. So going into our material editor, I'm going to go to render elements and add a multi-matte wherever it's hiding. There we go, multi-matte, and we'll just set this to is material ID. So we're just turning on the material IDs for the multi-matte, and this way we can start to set up all of our masks. Now, here's one thing. If I were to, let's say, go to liquid, and so with the liquid here, set this to be material ID 3, so this would be blue. So if we render it, we would spit out a blue channel for the material ID. Now if I go back and I set up my infection shader, I could set this, I might have jumped ahead and already done it, but like we can set that to 2, and so that's going to be green. So if I render that, we'll get both of those working. The tricky part about this is what's probably going to happen is when we set up the base material to be channel 1, which is red, so RGB, red, green, blue, what will happen is it will probably override everything, because technically the base shader is applied to everything. It doesn't have a mask to say to emit from certain areas. We're basically going to say that everything has that material ID, and then we're layering this other material ID on top. So that would affect the shader. So if we go down to multi-matte now, we can see channel 2, and then the liquid is channel 3. But if I go here and set this to channel 1, technically everything has that applied, like the head at least has that applied. So that's going to be a problem. Okay, so as we can see, it overwrites most of it. So we can't really use that. However, we go up the top, what I can do is get my infection shader, drag it to the next slot, choose swap, and do the same thing here, swap, and that way we've got an empty slot underneath it, and we'll drag the material base in there as a copy, and then I'm going to get the infection shader, I'm going to copy it up, and then we'll go in here and just say infection mask inverse. Okay, and then we should just be able to click invert on that, and what's going to happen now is the infection shader will be there, but then we're going to flip it so that way all the negative space gets inverted, and that will apply this second shader, and this is where we'll set this to material ID 1. So making sure that this is a copy, so this one here doesn't matter, this one here is now the base shader basically, and that's set to material ID 1. So let's try that now and to see if that changes things. And the other thing to keep in mind is obviously right now the liquid sitting on top, so you might be able to see it too much, but we can definitely see that we're seeing a different result here, so that's good. Obviously there's black areas because we're using the V-Ray distance texture, so even though it's inverted, it's still relying on that, and so that gives off empty areas. But this should be fine. Hopefully we won't need to tweak any more than that, but that's just the way that we'll overcome it, is that now this is material ID 1, it's material ID 2, and then liquid is material ID 3, the blue. And that way when we go into comp, we can get the red area, and then if we want to, we can basically blast that away and just use the green and the blue to mask a lot of our effect. So revealing this now. The blue and then the green. So that's looking pretty correct. There's some areas that get eaten up because it's going inside of the displacement. So it isn't 100% perfect, but I think for now, I'm hoping that this will be the surefire solution. Other things we could do if we wanted would be to set the diffuse color if we wanted to, you know, to be green, and then do the same thing for here as well. So set up the green. So I mean, that's one thing that we could try out as well. There's a few different options, and like it's just usually the way that I'm pointing out would work perfect. In fact, this is a terrible idea. I'll explain why in a second. But yeah, usually the way I mentioned would work out perfectly is just the fact that we're blending, we're using displacement, we're doing all these things. There isn't that absolute area because the displacement affects it. So there's definitely a bit of messing around that we're going to need to do. It's not too big a deal, and we can refer back to that soon. The problem with doing a completely green, self-illuminated object is just the fact that it's going to show up in reflections, and if we decide to use GI later on, it's going to contaminate the whole shot. So, you know, we'll let this render just for fun, but, you know, ideally this might work as a secondary mask later if we wanted to render it out, but I wouldn't recommend having it in the scene. We can set this up to not emit the shader onto the other objects, but yeah, it's just for now we won't worry about this. But I just want to kind of mention a few different options we have. So we may still go down that route just specifically to get a mask from it if we want to create our own custom maps. But for now, I'm going to keep those greens just as grays. We'll set these to 20. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of demonstrate a few different options we have. So just with the base here, I'm just going to set that to 20. So I just set the materials back to gray. Alright, so that is looking cool. And now what we need to do is just do that for the hand as well. Actually, before we get onto that though, let's talk more about the shader. So here's the tricky part. Like I said, the liquid, when it starts to progress through the shot, covers everything up. And I would really like to, especially on the fingers and the hands, get more infection showing up later in the shot. So obviously we hand painted everything because at the very beginning of the shot we want to have very specific areas that look very natural and procedural as the skin kind of breaks apart, as things kind of bubble up, as the liquid begins to come out. And that's exactly what that's there for. But as the liquid kind of takes over the shot, that's where things change. And that's where I want to introduce a new element now, which is basically just going to utilize what we currently have, but as the liquid comes out, I want it to make the shader underneath creep as if it's progressing across the face more. So what we'll do is we have the infection mask here, and I want to create something very similar to it, where we'll basically have an additional infection that's actually driven by the liquid itself. So for now, I'm just going to get our infection mask, copy it down to a new slot, just so we have a backup of that. And then we'll go back to this one, and I'm just going to get our V-Ray texture, cut it, go back up, paste that back in. So now we just have the one here. I'm just going to say liquid infection, and we'll remove the object here and apply the liquid instead. Okay, and we'll just make this a bit tighter. And let's take a look at that. So now we're actually using the liquid to blend around the area. So as the liquid moves down the face, it's actually going to kind of infect the face more as it creeps along. So you can see it's starting to do that already. So I'm going to go into the cellular map here. I'm just going to click Make Unique. I just want to do this as a precaution. I think it's fine. But so I made it unique, and I'm going to drag it as an instance onto here. I'm just doing this as a precaution. I think we don't need to do that. But anyway, main thing is, let's get our mid-tone color. I'm going to make this a little bit higher, and that way it's going to make these more opaque. I'm going to make this much more fine. And let's bring the midtones up more. And that's just really getting all the mids and bumping them all up, and that's just going to flood it out more. So we'll take a look at that. And I'm more interested in looking at the area on the face. Keep in mind that everything here is more in the foreground, which is where the hand is. We just have the hands hidden. So definitely looking at this area here. But we can see the liquid is now starting to infect and affect the face. Now, we're not doing anything with displacement. I don't want to worry about that. I'm just more focusing on getting some kind of color moving through and affecting it. Because it's such low frequency, you can kind of see it kind of looks more cracked and looks kind of cool. So finally, I just want to bump this up a little bit more. Let's just put the output color up a bit higher. Now that's definitely looking a lot more obvious. So it's up to you how much you do this. Obviously we don't want it to be overkill, but it might be something to play around with. So I might in fact tone that back. Let's try 1.5 and okay, so that's looking cool. Now we can go back up the top, and this is where if we want, we can just drag as an instance the infection shader down, click this one, and we'll just say mask infection. Or we can composite these two together as a texture and then have just one shader. So we've got a few options here. We'll try this out and just see how it looks. Just keep in mind to make the color of that black. Otherwise you're going to get all of that. Okay, so far that looks pretty good. I'm going to take a look at the multi-matte. Yeah, I'm not 100% in love with this setup, but for now we'll roll with it. We might need to do some tweaking at the very end when it comes to the shader masking or create our own custom map, just because I feel like this is a bit of a special case using the displacement, the blend textures, all that stuff together. You use like a V-Ray material wrapper or something. Could have been another option too, but for now I think this is looking good. Let's get onto the hand. So click character, bring it all back. We can freeze the head. We'll freeze the hand for now, and the other hand. All right, so we just got the top of the hand here. I like our setup, so we might as well just kind of mimic that for the most part. So I'm just going to get my infection shader, copy it. I think it already is instance, but we'll instance again. And then we'll go into our map. I think we mainly want to mimic the exact same setup as we had before. So it's going to double check 0.69, 1.3, 0.1. Infection, cellular, sorry, top one here, 1.3, 69, 0.01, 0.78. So yeah, I mean, these are already set up to be pretty good. This is the hand. So yeah, cellular map's fine. Color correction, obviously, we probably do a bit in here. So let's see. With this one, I desaturated it, and where am I? Gamma and contrast. Okay, yeah, I mean, I think the mask in general is totally fine. So I'm gonna swap, or I'm gonna instance this down. I'm gonna swap these around, and then let's just go and get the secondary texture, the liquid infection, copy it, and I'll do a paste copy just in case we need to tighten it up on the hand, because I imagine the hand's going to be a little bit more finicky. Alright, so I'm going to render out this portion. And you might notice I'm being pretty careful here, because I mean, usually I'm going to be a lot more gung-ho and just play with sliders and try and get the look that I'm after, but obviously I want to make sure that we're getting it right the first time. And looking at this, I mean, we have the texture reveal, and we've got the liquid one, and it's looking good. Obviously it creeps, the liquid one creeps beyond the hand, and that's fine. I expected that to happen. We are going to need to set up a custom shader specifically for the rest of the hand, because it doesn't have any UVs, so we can't just copy it over because it isn't set up for the hand. And that's what I was saying earlier about, in hindsight, it would have been better to do the entire hand, even though the unwrapping would have been a bit more complicated. So that's totally fine. With the liquid one here, I'm going to right click again, paste as an instance, just so we have that set up. Finally, I'm going to drag this down here, and let's just call this one wrist render shader, and we'll get rid of the texture infection. So we just have the liquid infection, and we'll assign that to the hand. Okay. There's still going to be some clipping as we get to the actual wrist. I know we're calling it wrist, but you know, but that'll be totally fine, because I mean the sleeve is a little bit beyond that anyway, and any hard sections, technically our masking should allow us to then like roto specific areas such as that, and then just, you know, applying roto just to the gray part. You know, I think that we should be fine. So I'm not too concerned about that. Okay, so at this point, you know, we kind of went through it pretty quick, but we have the liquid infection and the actual hand painted texture infection. We have the liquid. We got all this stuff set up, and it's working pretty well. I do feel like now in hindsight, the liquid blending is a little bit wimpy. So I'm kind of tempted to bump it up just a little bit more, so that way it matches a bit more with the actual liquid, but we can just see how we go with that. Yeah, just take another look at this. I might bump it up just a little bit. So this is purely the liquid infection, which I believe are all instanced. So with the cellular, I'm going to go down to output amount. I might set this to 1.5, and I'm just going to render one section. All I'm looking is just to kind of push it to make it a little bit stronger in those areas, and then I might need to match the color just slightly more, because right now it's a lot stronger red than the blood is, so it kind of stands out. So I'm going to try 2. I might come back to that, but the infection shader, I think I'm going to pull the saturation back a little bit and the brightness back a little bit. Now it looks like I thought these were linked up, so I'm just going back to the face, just because I noticed I was color correcting that and I'm not getting. So I'm going to paste instance. I'm just not getting any adjustments. So I'm just going to go back to this. I'm going to pull these two down again and render it out. I just noticed the hand was being color corrected separately, so I just want to make sure that's an instance for that shader, since we're pretty much using it everywhere. So yeah, okay, cool. So let's see, pull the saturation back up. I just drastically cranked that down just to see if I was getting any change. Okay, so I think that's working out pretty well. Our things here are looking a bit weird. So I mean, if we wanted to, we could definitely play with these pores, since they're definitely a bit odd. I'm just looking at like final tweaks basically. So I don't mind having them there. It's just I feel like they're either we need to have a lot of displacement on them, or they need to kind of be toned back a little bit. So I'm just going to get my displacement for that specific cellular map instance and bring the spread up. And add a little bit more displacement. Okay, it's looking a little bit better. It's such a subtle thing, but I think that, you know, we just want to make sure we don't have any weird shapes. So I'll set that to 2. I'll bring my RGB level up. Okay, it's looking better. Finally, I'm just going to make it 0.7, I think. So the spread, all it's doing is kind of contrast. We're getting the mid tones, and we're just kind of splitting them apart by adjusting the spread up. And I put the RGB level up just because that's going to crank the areas that are bright even brighter. And it's just a combination of the two are going to give me a lot more contrast, as you can see in the texture. And I'm going to hide my liquid for a moment just so I can really see what this looks like. But that's the whole point, is I just didn't want to have these like spheres sitting there. They looked really weird. So just by doing this, we're getting some kind of more irregular shape. So it's not perfect, but it's something. I'm going to have one last attempt at really breaking this up. And I might make the size even smaller. And then finally, I just set the displacement amount to 1. So that's what we're getting. It looks a lot better. So yeah, I just set my displacement amount to 1. I just cranked it up a little bit more. But yeah, I think that at least now they're not looking like spheres as they were earlier, like over there. So I think that works. We could also add, if we wanted to, displacement to our liquid. But for now, like, yeah, just to clarify, in case, because there was this like one step at the earlier on where as we go into the shaders, I was going to add displacement, and I'm pretty sure I didn't, but either way, I'm probably not going to, just because there's probably not really much point for something of this scale. So I don't think we need to worry about that. But if we want to just for fun, we could go to our infection shader and copy the diffuse and go to our liquid. Just for fun, I paste it as a copy, and let's just see what that looks like with the kind of meaty texture applied to it. I'm pretty happy with what we already have, so I don't imagine we're going to do it, but I just figured it might be interesting to kind of bring on like a really high contrast thing like that. So it definitely makes it darker. I did make this a copy as well, so and the reason it's darker is because we're not blending between all these different shaders, so it doesn't have as much effect. So this is a copy, it's not instanced. So I'm just going to go into the map itself. I'll bring this back to 1. And I might bring the brightness up as well. Like I said, I'm going to throw it away. I just wanted to, for fun, throw it in there to see, you know, what kind of results we get. Wow, that definitely has a huge effect on it. I'll try 0.45. It's actually not too bad. So I've got that rendered. I'm going to just say render a section of this without the map, and let's just take a look. So there isn't really that much of a difference. Let me cancel out of that. But I don't know, I don't mind it. I might actually keep that on. So just kind of a lucky random win there, but that kind of works out pretty well. So I think at this point, you know, we've done a lot of noodling around with the shaders, but we've built it all up in a way that I think, you know, this is going to look really good. What I'll suggest at this point, we still have this arm. I'm going to right click and go View Object Properties. I'm going to make that a matte object. But everything else here, I think we're in a pretty good space. I'll show it. I'll show you the whole thing. So I do have the HDRI in here right now. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, like I'm just throwing something random in. I'm not, personally, I'm not really worried about what our background is. That's not the scope of this tutorial that we're doing. So, you know, right now this is looks like some kind of beer garden. So, you know, it's not probably the most accurate thing, but it it'll do for what we're trying to pull off. Okay, so maybe this guy is in agony because he hasn't gotten his beer yet, but the whole point is that we can drop in any HDRI, we can drop in any plate we want. We're obviously doing it on green screen. That's going to be the next big challenge once we render it all out. But from this point, we'll start to render out our passes and get it all into comp. So looking at that, it's looking pretty cool. We have our multi-matte, which is that currently, which may or may not work. I mean, you know, basically it works. It's just because of all the blending. I think that there's certain things that don't transfer over too well between the map blend, the mask, and the displacement together. It's a pretty far out combination. So for now, we'll render this out and we might make a custom shader for it as well. So I'm just going to go into elements here. I'm just going to spit out a few different passes. The main thing is going to be, I'd love to mess with CryptoMatte for this, but I know it's going to slow down our renders and it's probably not going to have a huge payoff. So I will have a denoiser, diffuse filter. I think we need to worry about these. I was tempted to do ambient occlusion. I might still do lighting. Okay, so actually this brings up a good point. So we don't have motion blur for this. This is one thing that right now it looks like the V-Ray needs to be updated to be able to support the max fluids. So it doesn't really understand what the motion is doing. You can't read the motion. And because of that, like I think Arnold will do it, but V-Ray, it just needs to be updated basically to support the max fluids. So we can't output any velocity right now, which is unfortunate. I might do a Z-depth just in case specular shadows. So yeah, with the motion blur, it's going to be tricky for a couple of reasons. One is that it's liquid, and liquid motion blurring can be kind of tricky because from a technical standpoint, the topology is always changing, and it's also transparent, as has reflections, has a lot going on. So there's going to be a few curveballs with getting the motion blur to work, whereas with liquid, it is critical that you have motion blur. Without motion blur, it's always going to look weird. So one thing we haven't gone into at all with this, because again, I'm just trying to go through the critical steps, but one thing we haven't gone into is V-Ray sampling and really kind of getting into getting high quality shaders and really optimizing a lot of that. I'm kind of trying to really focus on this not being V-Ray centric, and because of that, like there's a lot of stuff that we're neglecting with V-Ray that I'd love to get into, but it's just going to make this much bigger. And one of the big goals, I probably haven't communicated this yet because I didn't plan to, but I really wanted the emphasis of this free training, not because it's free, but this time around to be pretty straightforward. And even though it is still looking at around 10 hours right now for the whole course, the reason is because I've put out a lot of, even in the past year, put out a lot of free training, and it's just really overwhelming because I've wanted to put in everything I can and really make it everything it can be. And I want to do that as well with this training, but I don't want to end up going and spending hours explaining a lot of stuff that I have explained before in other training, and yeah, just kind of make it too overwhelming. So I've wanted to try and keep it not as reliant on plugins other than Fume effects, and at the same time, yeah, not really overemphasizing like key steps. So one of the key things I really wanted to do was do wet maps for this one, but to do that we need to go into MCG and build like a custom vertex channel painting system based on the fluids, and there's just like a bunch of stuff that we would need to do, and it would end up being like a 2-hour lesson and going to MCG as well, which can be a bit overwhelming, just to explain that one key step. So there's definitely been some certain things that I've had to kind of tiptoe around, which I'm not used to doing. I like to take pride in really going all out, and I feel like this training is, but yeah, I want to keep it on point. So with all this, we got our multi-mat. I'm going to do the extra text. Might as well spit out some kind of ambient occlusion, and I'm going to do a Z-depth. We might as well have that just in case we want to do any depth of field. So getting our camera, I'm just going to, oh man, yeah, this is tricky with ambient occlusion. So what I'll do is I'm just going to quickly create a target camera just for a second, and I'm really just looking at the distance, so 0 to 100 basically. Okay, so 0, 100 for the, let's say 130 for the Z-depth. Extra text, I'm just going to go in, make a new map, V-Ray dirt, and this is just how we do our ambient occlusion. So I'm going to drag that map in there as an instance, set the radius to about 3, and I'm just going to render out a quick frame. Let's just check our Z-depth and ambient occlusion really quick. Okay, so V-Ray extra text, that's giving us that as our ambient occlusion, which looks fine. And really want to see how terrible our sample rates are. Alright, so with the Z depth, I might bring this back. Let's set this to 95. Let's set this to 90. Doesn't really matter too much, but I'm just going to crunch the ranges a little bit, and I might clamp the minimum in a little bit as well. Alright, so I'll set this to 105 and 10. So all I'm trying to do is just get a min-max range that's, you know, even though it's float 16-bit, we got a lot of information. I still just want to kind of get a good overall range for this. And all it's going to do is it just means that if I want to do any depth of field, I can soften it out. Because if we did decide to use this background here, then I definitely want to blur it because it is low res. So finally, going to the rendering menu, let's go environment, and under rendering environment, I'm just going to drop this map in as an instance, as reflection, refraction, and then we can, oops, turn it off. So that way we're just getting rid of the background, and if it's just set up so that way if we decide to use GI or anything, we have that option. Yeah, overall I think that we're in a pretty good spot here. I'm gonna basically save this out as my render pass, so that way, so save your work. But now what we'll do is anytime we're going to submit a pass, I want to save that file, so that way if I need to go back and resubmit it again, I have the exact file that got submitted to the farm. You would not believe how many times, like, I've had artists I'm supervising overwrite their files, and then I say, hey, do not change a thing, that is perfect, just render it out 2K and we're done, and they're like, I don't have it anymore. So you know, that's why all the tools that I write in the FXTD mentorship, we set it up so that way if it like submits a render, it also clones and backs up the file elsewhere, so that way we have like a file somewhere, because disk space is cheap, man hours are expensive, is my whole philosophy. So alright, so I'm just going to save this out, and I'm just going to make a directory called render passes, and then finally I'm just going to submit this with calls beauty, and that's our file. So really important, let's before we go any further, let's just set up our render settings. So make sure our region is turned off. Let's switch this from progressive to bucket, and for now I'm just going to set my subdivs pretty low, like 6, and I'll crank them up later if I need to. I'm going to set my bucket to 12, displacement's on. We have motion blur. I don't think it's really going to help too much. It will help with the hands and things like that, but yeah, so we'll turn motion blur on. I'll try doing a pre-pass and put up the geo samples. It won't really make that much of a difference on this. Putting this to 0.005 just for the noise threshold. So in general, I'm going to keep this all the same, V-Ray triangle filter. I'm just going through some basic settings. Nothing that's really going to affect the look of this at all. Yeah, keep that 0. Okay, so I'm going to save this now, and this is going to be my pass that it will submit to render. So obviously make it active time segment, save out the file, make sure we save as an EXR, so that way it embeds all the render elements. And now that I've done that, I'm going to go back and just, actually not overwrite, but increment my original file, just because now we're kind of getting into the rendering and all that good stuff. So now that we have that set up, the next thing that I want to do is look at our fume effects, which we've been neglecting for quite a while. So with these, obviously we still want to work with our geometry and everything. We've got a few different options here. Personally, I think that these renders are very fast, so I don't mind rendering this again. We're not even using GI or anything, so I don't mind rendering our fume effects passes with all the geometry in it. It's a little bit sloppy, but I honestly think it's not that big a deal. And the main reason is because we do have some displacements that are based on the modifier, but I'm pretty sure we have some that are also using displacement in the materials. So because of that, I think it's just safer to do that. But I don't know, just for fun, let's not do that. So I'm going to select all my geo. Including the liquid. I'm going to say V-Ray properties. Let's make this a matte object. -1, have a shadow. I'm going to go object properties now and say don't cast a shadow. And then let's set up a new V-Ray material. And we'll make this black. So we're just getting rid of everything that we've done so far. Now, right away, I'm going to save this as an atmospheric. So I'm going to call this steam. So render passes, whoops. And then we'll call this steam. Okay. And I'm doing that more because I'm paranoid about like butchering my file. So I just want to make sure I'm saving it elsewhere. And we can get rid of all of that and just add in V-Ray atmosphere. And let's just look at the steam so far, because we haven't really worried about the shaders for this yet. So I'm just going to look at one frame of this, but we'll render it out and take a look. But basically, with the steam, like, you know, if we want to make it thinner or do anything like that, I was tempted to look at using the V-Ray volume grid for this, and maybe I'll do that as a separate lesson. If that's something you're interested in, let me know, and I'll try to put together a separate lesson specifically going through the V-Ray volume grid shader in case you want to render it with the HDRI and everything and get it all integrated. But for now, I'm just rendering with fume effects. So one thing, atmospheric's turned off, so we're just going to turn that back on. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. We've got one more lesson to go. As I mentioned earlier on, like, don't rush yourself. You know, you've got time to go through this training and make the most of it. You know, don't feel like you've got to go through it all and check all the boxes. If you don't get it, if this doesn't resonate with you, then why move forward? Why not go back and spend a bit more time, really go through the bits and pieces that maybe you got stuck or needed light and shed on? Ask me and I'm happy to shed light. I'm happy to explain. I'm happy to help you, because I don't want you to get left behind. Okay, so that's here for, is to make sure that you get it, that you understand every step of this as you go through it. I think it's really critical. And yeah, just remember, this isn't a race. Some people, especially in LAS and in the mentorship, they go through it and sometimes spend an extra week or two just really absorbing something, making their own shots and figuring things out and having fun with it. Other people, you know, go, but I do see there's a small number of people who they see someone else like plow through it all and they think, well, crap, I'm behind, I gotta get caught up as well. So they start skipping ahead. And I'd rather you go through it and really understand it rather than it be something where you're racing through and it's just skimming over the surface. Okay, so make the most of this. You've got the time, so do it. Go through it all, and any bits you got stuck or need the light shed on, ask me. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to be there for you. So I'll leave it there for now, but next lesson, the big one, we're going to be taking everything that we've done so far and we're going to be pushing it even further. We're going to learn about doing green screen removal, which to some people is a no-brainer, but I definitely want to talk about that as well. We're going to be covering a lot of grading the shot, doing comp tricks, building up all our mats and everything else. A little tiny bit of roto, nothing too crazy. But more importantly, we're going to be taking all of our elements and we're going to be putting it through the final process. Okay, so I'm excited about this, and like I said, take your time, go through this, spend the time to really absorb it. It's worth making sure that you really understand it all before you move forward. Okay, so check your inbox. I'll be back with the final video.